connecting now. All right, so Carlos, I hand the screen to you.
Yeah,
sorry. This is Victor speaking. So I'm going to introduce Carlos because I think this is the first time Carlos.
Good idea. Good idea. Yeah, I apologize.
Acting as a host of a speaker. So I think most of you already know Carlos Melia, but just in case, I mean, he's a Maria de Zambrano fellow. So he's going to be with us for a couple of years until the end of next year. So his background is, I will say, theoretical ecology, but to me, he's interested in any aspect of the architecture of ecosystems in general, from genes to phenotypes to speciation. So the kind of topics he's working is quite broad. And I'm sure he welcomes anybody who's interested to talking with him. I mean, you can just approach him, and that's easy. So this is one of the activities Carlos has proposed as part of his fellowship. So it's a series of talks for this spring summer session. So this is the first one, and in the next one there are going to be another a couple of 2 more talks. And unfortunately, the idea was to have Catalina with us at the 5th, but well, you know, there are always problems coming there. So unfortunately, she was unable to make it, and this is why we have this seminar online. So I hope that we'll have the opportunity to have Catalina, I don't know, in the autumn or next year with us, because I think she's doing a very nice job. So I think many of us could enjoy having her around. So with this, just Carlos, you can introduce. I mean, I don't know if all the talks that you have prepared for this season, or just Catalina.
Yes, I can.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. I can briefly. I think Catalina deserves to be briefly introduced. She just got the John Maynard Smith Prize from the European Society of Evolutionary Biology this year. This prize targets outstanding young evolutionary biologists. So congratulations, Catalina. I'm going to briefly mention the novelty of her work. I think there are 3 main components. One is regime shifts. She has been contributing, adding trait evolution and adaptive evolution to classical problems, mostly driven by ecological processes. So she has been working on these topics, adding evolution. This is one of the main novelties. The second is she has been adding also the paradox of enrichment, which is a classical problem in ecology. But she has been also adding evolution and adaptive radiations to this problem to obtain new and quite novel results. And the third maybe novelty from Catalina's work is around the paradox of sex. She's going to introduce us today with some of these problems. And essentially, similar to the paradox of enrichment, most people have been working only from short-term maintenance of sexual reproduction, but she has been working in long-term maintenance, so diversification, ecological diversification in sexual and asexual populations. Catalina is currently a postdoctoral Marie Curie Fellowship at EABAC, belonging to the ETH domain in Switzerland. She got his PhD in theoretical ecology with André de Ros in the Netherlands, in the Institute for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Dynamics. And Catalina started studying biology, environmental engineering in the University of Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. So she has been moving along, and as I think most of us scientists are in a nomadic sense. So thank you, Catalina, for being here, and yeah, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos and Victor, for the introduction. Yeah, maybe with respect to your 2 introductions, I would like to say, yeah, that we tried to make it in person, but also, so I am a young mom of a young baby, and this makes also difficult to travel, which one of the advantages I think of the pandemic was that we have to become more we had to become more flexible, and in general conferences start to be also in hybrid mode. And this is not only environmentally friendly but also family friendly, and I would have never realized of that until I have a little baby. So thank you still for the opportunity to letting me share my science through this virtual mode that also makes my life easier. And yeah, thank you, Carlos, for the introduction. So I think the time will not be enough to go through all those topics that you enumerated. But I will try my best. So let's start. Let's see. Yes. So I am interested in how ecological and evolutionary processes influence each other and determine in this way the behavior of ecosystems. So it is pretty intuitive for most biologists, even at the beginning of their career, and that the environment can affect the ecology, and ecology can affect evolution. And like the classical example of that comes from a textbook example of the, if you have received probably a basic course in biology, you have heard of it, but just a quick reminder that of the story of these moths in Manchester. So before the Industrial Revolution, here in this time, the white morph was more common in, was almost the only type of morph that existed, type of organism that existed in the surroundings of in the forest that surrounded Manchester, because the trees had like this very whitish type of surface, which was making this morph to be very good at camouflage. But when the Industrial Revolution happened, the smoke that sticks to the trees make them darker, and then quickly this black type of moth took over super fast until later in the 60s, 70s, when new measures to improve the quality of air were implemented. The smoke was reduced, and then again the white morph took over. So it is pretty clear that the environment can affect the ecological conditions. So here is what the ecology will be, what is like this interaction between the habitat and the color of the organisms, and this will make this trait, which is the color, to evolve. But then the other part of the loop that corresponds from evolution to ecology had been a bit more debated, because if the question was mostly, there's no doubt that it happens in long-term dynamics, but can it be enough fast evolution to affect ecological processes back? So evidence have been accumulating in the last decades. And a very nice example, but this review is very nice if you're interested in seeing a lot of examples of this feedback loop. And one very nice illustration of one of those examples is the case of Caribbean lizards. So basically, the small anolis is a type of small lizard. They were growing in some of these islands, almost everywhere, but they prefer clearly the trunks and the rocks of the forest. But then in some of these islands, this big called the curly-tailed lizard, that is predator of this is predating on the small lizards, was introduced. So what happened when they were introduced? First, the small lizards first decrease in population size, just normal. This is pure ecological dynamics. And then they started to move. And then they started to move to habitats that were higher in the trees, such that they avoid predation that occurs mostly in the low parts. So what happened when they were in the high part? So this habitat shift made them to start to get adapted to these thinner branches, and so their limbs change and other characteristics of their body change to live more adapted to this area. So evolution happened, and then these new adaptations make them to have again higher population densities. So this feedback in ecology. But interestingly, these higher population densities of lizards in the higher parts of the trees also made where the scientists were able to measure that they had an impact on the densities of insects and other arthropods that lives in the high parts of the forest. So as the densities of the small lizards increased when they migrated to this new habitat, and then they became adapted to that habitat, at the same time, the densities of arthropods decreased. So I hope that with this example, I have convinced you that this whole eco to evo and evo to eco feedback is common, or at least that it can happen, and it can happen in timescales that are very commensurate. So with this in mind, and knowing that this feedback loop is central to the ecosystems, we need to keep it in, we need to bear in mind this feedback to understand how ecosystems assemble, function, and respond to environmental changes. So I will go through the following questions. So how the eco-evolutionary feedback affect the dynamics of bistable ecosystems? How the eco-evolutionary feedback affect the emergence of novel trophic interactions in adaptive radiations? And don't worry, I will start the topic by explaining what is an adaptive radiation. And lastly, although I think there won't be that much time, the bonus will be to talk about ecological diversification, if ecological diversification could explain diversity patterns associated to different reproductive modes. So I will start talking about eco-evolutionary feedbacks in bistable ecosystems. So basically the theory in ecosystem resilience, or theory of tipping point ecosystem tipping point, is based on the existence of alternative stable states that are here I represent by these two different, sorry, I will start. Let's put it again, sorry. So these two different minima in the landscape represent two different alternative stable states. So basically some ecosystems, this is an important clarification, not all of them, but some ecosystems can have alternative stable states, so such that the ecological state can exist for the very same parameter values in two different states, and then where it is depends only on the history of the system. So what does this theory establishes? I will show here. So as the environment is changing, for example, environmental stress is increasing, the system will slowly move, but once a threshold is passed, the system will move from one stable state to another. And this movement will happen even if we stop increasing environmental stress just because one of the stable states disappear, then the dynamics are immediately attracted by the other stable state. So alternative stable states have been documented in a variety of ecosystems, such as lakes, coral reefs, deserts, and also in aquatic trophic networks. These catastrophic transitions, known as regime shift, so the transition from one stable state to the other, like the last part that happened in my video, are also known as ecosystem tipping or regime shifts, and occur as I show you. What is known in the theory, or what is thought in existing theory of ecology, is that they occur when an environmental threshold is exceeded. Regime shifts can happen through different mechanisms, but so far ecology has focused mostly in bifurcation tipping, which is actually the one I show in this video. So I will use the shallow lake ecosystem as example to investigate how eco-evolutionary feedbacks affect bistable systems. But the results and the way this model was constructed applies to other ecosystems, and actually well, in the references through the results I will show you, you will find a reference in the right bottom part of the slides, or you will see that this investigation was done for different ecological systems, and the results are qualitatively the same. But let's then start with the shallow lake. So shallow lakes can exist in two different alternative stable states: the clear water state and the turbid state. So the clear water state is usually desired, or the turbid state, because it has higher biodiversity, and its structure is more diverse, and it can then provide more ecosystem services. So although it's an ecosystem, and therefore there are many more species, and there are different mechanisms that can cause the transition between alternative stable states. It is thought that the two key species in the system causing this, causing the existence of alternative stable states, are the competition between macrophytes and microscopic algae. So in the clear water state, the system is dominated by macrophytes, which are these like big vegetation, like plants, but that live underwater. While in the turbid state, the system is dominated by the microscopic algae. Okay. So in a very, as you can see, this system is super simple. Basically, these macrophytes can grow. This is their per capita growth rate given by a turnover. And so if you are familiar with logistic growth, all this will be the logistic growth. But then here we have an additional term, which is the inhibition of macrophyte growth caused by algae. And the algae has a very similar equation in which all this again is the per capita growth rate. Sorry, from R to here. With modified logistic growth due to the inhibition that macrophytes cause to the growth of algae. So basically, just these two equations can show this type of behavior. For now, I'm just showing the only ecological dynamics. And what we observe here is that when environmental stress, which in this case is nutrient load or the concentration of phosphorus and nitrogen or other nutrients in the water. So when this nutrient load is low, the system can exist only in the state in which macrophytes dominate, which is the clear water state. When the nutrient loading is high, then the system exists only in the case in which macrophytes are at a very low concentration or density, sorry, and at intermediate levels of environmental stress, both the clear water state and the turbid state can coexist. So separated these two states by an unstable state that separates their basins of attraction. So, so the question is how gradual deterioration of the environment would affect the behavior of the system. So if we imagine that we start from a system with very low environmental stress, so at the left part here, and we increase gradually the nutrient loading up to a certain level, following this arrow, so something like what I'm showing here, in which the orange arrow does not exceed threshold 1, but the purple arrow is exceeding this threshold. Like the classical theory in ecology would tell us that in the orange case, the system persists in the clear water state, the one dominated by macrophytes. But in the purple trajectory, the macrophyte population will crash and we will have a regime shift from the clear water state to the turbid state. So I guess for most of you, this is not new. In this case, the occurrence of a regime shift is determined by the magnitude of the maximum environmental stress that the ecosystem experiences. This is what is called in general bifurcation tipping. And most policy in aiming to prevent the ecosystem tipping, focusing what this mechanism of tipping says. So basically, if we want to prevent the system to tip to the undesired state, what this policy recommends is to fix a magnitude that is safe, and any changes in the environment below this magnitude should be safe. Yeah, so this is basically the idea before bifurcation tipping. But this paradigm in ecological theory has been based on understanding how ecological processes influence the occurrence of regime shifts. And it has neglected evolutionary processes. So yeah, my interest has been to study how introducing evolution, this what I presented before would be changed or would be affected. So so first, let's see how we can add evolutionary dynamics to such a system that is bistable. So the key between connecting ecology and evolution is traits, because traits will determine how organisms respond to their environment, in that environment also including other species with they interact. So, so for example, in this system that is super simple, we have basically the interaction between algae and macrophyte, and this interaction is controlled by traits. those traits were, it's not that they did, I mean, it's not that they are inventing something, it's just that in the parameters of the equations I showed you before, basically, like some of those rates were considered fixed parameters, but actually we can think that many of those rates depend on the traits of organisms, so we can make them also time dependent. So I will use then quantitative genetics as framework for the evolutionary dynamics. So quantitative genetics assumes that traits are distributed normally with a mean X value and some variants that can have different components, but I'm going to focus only on the genetic component. And for now, I'm not going to assume that there are other components. I mean, I will assume that the only component of variance in the population comes from the genetics. Then these traits usually come with trade-offs. You cannot become the best at supporting or tolerating a lot of environmental stress while you are the best also in the best conditions. So usually if you get an increase in tolerance to environmental stress, you should have to pay this with a cost in performance at low environmental stress. So it sounds a bit like why for non-ecologists, but so an example of that would be, for example, in the macrophytes, you might gain tolerance to turbidity, and this has been, for example, a way it has been tested that, for example, increasing the amount of photopigments, you can increase your tolerance to turbidity. So photopigments are the substance that the plants and other photosynthesizing organisms use to capture photons that will allow them to do photosynthesis. So if you have more photopigments, you can do photosynthesis, you can capture more photons, so you will be able to support a higher level of turbidity. But there is a limiting amount of building blocks, for example, for proteins, or also energy that is available for an organism. So if you are investing in more energy and more materials to build photopigments, you are removing it from somewhere else. So this is very clear that there is a trade-off between, for example, increased photopigment production and reduce growth at high light conditions. So you are good at one of the two things. So these were represented through some functions on how the carrying capacity and the tolerance to turbidity will affect the performance of macrophytes. So coming back to this system, what I just say about these functions is represented here. I'm not writing the function complete, but this is an effect on the carrying capacity of the trait. So now carrying capacity is not anymore a fixed parameter, but it's a function of a trait. And here we have the effect that algae, which produces turbidity, has on macrophytes. So somehow this is like the tolerance to turbidity, or the tolerance to be surrounded by more algae. Then I can introduce the dynamics for the trait. And I was saying that traits are the key to connect these two things, ecology and evolution. Why? Because you remember I told you that all these is the per capita growth rate. Well, this is also the fitness. I mean, per capita growth rate is the fitness of an organism. So I can, and actually, according to quantitative genetics, the dynamics of a trait depend on the genetic variance, which I said before is my only source of variance now, just to simplify the problem, and the fitness gradient, which then just follow from here. So I think now you realize that so basically, okay, then you probably realize that this equation, the ecology of macrophytes and the ecology and the trait changes are very connected, but they just have different time scales. And this is going to be very important in what I'm going to present after. So does evolutionary dynamics alter system stability? So with the new system I built, I tried to find the equilibrium points. And this is what I had showed you before when there was no evolution. And now with evolution, not surprisingly, because in this case, the trait confers tolerance to turbidity. The system has this tipping point or bifurcation point shifted to a higher level of nutrient loading. So basically, evolution would enable the system to tolerate a higher level of environmental stress. So yes, then I will ask exactly the same question that has been explored before in the case of no evolution. So I will investigate in the evolutionary scenario what happened if nutrient loading is gradually increased from very low levels to levels beyond the threshold, this new threshold, and below this threshold. So when the nutrient loading is increased beyond the threshold, we observe what we expect, right? Like we pass the bifurcation point, then the system collapses to the macrophyte population collapses and the system becomes turbid. So this is exactly what we observe here, this regime shift. But then also when we don't cross this threshold, the system can also collapse, or it cannot collapse. So the difference between these two orange trajectories is just the speed at which nutrient loading is increasing. So when nutrient loading increases, you can see that the maximum nutrient loading was the same, but the difference was this slope. So when nutrient loading increases fast, the system collapses. It experiences a regime shift, but when it does it slowly, it does not collapse. So now we're finding that the magnitude of the maximum environmental stress is not enough to determine the occurrence of regime shifts. This is, yes, so this contrast with what classical ecological theory had said. And so what happened when the, so I'm going to go back to compare only ecological dynamics with eco-dynamics. And for that, I'm going to now like repeat several of these simulations, but increasing also at different rate the nutrient loading. And what we observe is that when there is only ecological dynamics, we never observe ecosystem tipping or regime shifts in this area, but always in this area where the threshold has been exceeded. Instead, when we have eco-evolutionary dynamics, what we observe is that above the threshold, the ecosystem always tips, but below the threshold, the ecosystem may tip or may not tip, and this will depend only on the rate of increase of nutrient loading. So if nutrient loading increases fast, then the risk of regime shift is higher than if it increases slowly. So now the occurrence of regime shift is determined by both the magnitude of the maximum environmental stress and the rate at which stress increases. And all what it was here, so above the threshold, is what is called bifurcation tipping. So the question is, what is this other region of regime shifts that also occur, but before the threshold? So, well, it's a different mechanism of tipping called rate tipping, which probably some of you have heard of. In dynamical systems, it was described in 2012, I think, and since that there has been quite a lot of research in mostly in physics, dynamical systems, but in ecology is pretty new. I think the first papers about rate tipping appears around 2019, and they were, so what is the commonality of rate tipping is that systems had processes occurring at different time scales. And if you remember, I told you before when I was showing you the OD system that the ecological dynamics of macrophages were very similar, or had a lot in common with the trait dynamics of macrophages, but the processes were just going in different time scales. And this is exactly what we are observing here. So evolutionary dynamics usually occurs slower than ecological dynamics. It doesn't mean that that they are completely non-overlapping. Yeah, maybe they overlap, but they don't occur exactly at the same speed. So basically, evolution is making this bifurcation to move farther and farther and farther in the stability plot that I show you. But if evolution occurs too slow, then the environmental that is changing will cause the system to tip before it has reached the ultimate point. And then, so here what is key is the balance between the rate of environmental change and the rate of evolution. So if the rate of environmental change is too fast and the rate of evolution too slow, we are mostly in this scenario in which we have high risk of regime shifts. Okay, so I have presented you a case in which regime shift or ecosystem tipping may occur before a critical environmental threshold was exceeded, or at least the ultimate threshold that was predicted by the stability analysis. So I'm going to show you now another case by which this can happen. So, so in this scenario, imagine environmental stress is increasing. And what we would observe, according to ecological theory, is that, okay, environmental stress stops here, so it did not cross the threshold. The system might have lost some resilience, but it's still in this stable state because the bifurcation point has not been crossed. But this is ignoring evolution. Now, let's see what happened. If we take, so in this paper here, we hypothesize that evolution might have an effect that can, in that same scenario of environmental stress, produce a regime shift. And it is basically exemplified by this video. So environmental stress is now changing the surface, as I showed before. But in this axis that is represented now by the evolving trade, the system can now move. Remember that before we did not have that dimension, then we completely ignored that the system could have moved by there. And then a threshold or a critical threshold will be crossed by the evolving trade much later than when the environmental stress changes was occurring. This will lead then much later to a regime shift. So they can occur long time after the change in the environment, because the change in the environment did not drive the system beyond a bifurcation, but because it triggered an evolutionary process, and it's the evolutionary process the one that drive the trade beyond the critical value. So so that was the hypothesis, and we use a system in which a population fits in two different food resources in different times of their life, because in this system, it has been already proven before that there is biostability. And what we found is that, so if there is no evolution happening, and at the time of the dotted line, we introduce some change in the environment, the system might change, yes, in its internal dynamics, but somehow it remains not too far from there. So you can see the trade doesn't move because evolution does not allow it to change. But then if evolution is allowed, the trade starts to decrease, and because through a process of natural selection. And as this trade is decreasing, the system seems to actually dampen the oscillations and kind of approach to the behavior it had before, but eventually it will reach a bifurcation point where a regime shift can occur. So I lost the name, but yeah. So we call these evolutionary driven regime shifts. And as I told you, they happen because the system crosses the a critical threshold, but through the trade, not through the environment. Now I would like to move to, so I present to you mostly what has been an ecological problem, which is a ecosystem tipping point, and that was usually approached from the only ecological processes. Now I will move to a problem that is mostly evolutionarily, yes, an evolutionary problem. And but that by itself it was already quite connected to ecology, and we use again models to understand how this feedback affects the system. So it's about evolutionary emergence of novel trophic interactions in adaptive radiations. Well, first, what is an adaptive radiation? An adaptive radiation is an array of species exploiting a variety of food resources and that originated from a single ancestral species. So, okay, if I go back, yes. So all these fishes are today they are not all, they are some of the extant or alive fishes that you can find in Lake Victoria in Africa, the largest tropical lake in the world. And all they originated from single ancestral species. This happened in very short time. In just 15,000 years, the fish passed from one ancestral population to more than 500 different species. So some of them are here. Now, these organisms, these species, feed in very different food resources. So for example, some feed in algae, others feed on plankton, like the gray, others in snails, and actually these required very morphological adaptation that is very specific to crush the snails. Other feed on insects, the ones that are purple here. In general, all morphologically are very different. Some are more far than others, but in general, it requires to feed in each one of these resources, it requires very specific morphologies. But interestingly, also, some species that emerge feed on other organisms that are within this radiation that belongs to the same lineage. So the question that we made with Olde Seehausen and other collaborators was how the productivity or what is necessary for the emergence of these predators within a radiation, because all these resources that I show you here, they existed before the ancestral population arrived, but the fish eggs and the fish, they just existed once the radiation was there. Once all these species had already appeared, then these resources exist. So, so how is the emergence of those predators, and how then their environment affect the emergence, and once they emerge, what is their effect on the diversification process? And so for that we use again an eco-evolutionary model in which the ecology part corresponds to an Lotka-Volterra model and the evolution quantitative genetics. So again, everything is connected through traits. In this case, the trait that we focus is the feeding trait that determines the resource of different food, the use of different food resources. So we assume that there is a one-dimension ecological axis, and there exists optimals to each to feed on each one of these resources. And as you and is the trait. So imagine this is the trait axis, goes far from any of those optimals, then the rate at which this food is consumed, this particular resource, decreases in a Gaussian way. We included the feeding also on other individuals of the lineage. And then so the model looks something like that. We have just, we have n number of equations for the resources, so it depends on how many resources we put. And the ecomorphs, they are all emerging. So we start always from one population, and evolution happens through natural selection, and every time evolution is disruptive, we split the population into this. I will show it a bit later. But so basically, the resources can grow by themselves and are depleted by the consumption of the fish. Then the fish have per capita growth rate that depend on the birth rate, which is all these. This birth rate is affected or increases with more ingestion of pre-existing food resources, plus the ingestion on other fishes. If you have all that depends on the trade. So if you have the correct trade, you will have a high attack rate on a given resource or on specific or other individuals of the radiation. And the mortality, we have a background mortality and mortality due to predation. So through the evolution, we again assume like quantitative genetics, and it depends on the fitness gradient, as in the what I showed you before. And when the fitness gradient is 0, so we are like in an evolutionary attractor. At that point, we evaluate the curvature of the fitness landscape, and when this curvature is positive, it means that selection is disruptive. So an ecomorph population diversifies, is split into 2 independent populations. So this is following adaptive dynamics theory. What did we find? We found that when productivity is too low, we have no diversification. If we put one population, it can persist there. I mean, at very low productivity, it cannot. But once there is a certain amount of productivity, then the population can persist in this habit. But not speciate, not diversify. There is a minimum then threshold of habitat productivity at which diversification occurs, but the predator cannot evolve. Then there is another threshold at which the predator evolves, and surprise, you don't have more species because one additional trophic level is added, but actually diversification, the final diversity of the final diversity of the lineage, which is what I'm plotting in the vertical axis, decreases with productivity once the predator evolves. So we derived analytically the conditions for diversification, and we found that mortality due to predation by other ecomorphs should be smaller than a constant C. That depends on all these things, but here what is important is that here we have productivity. So this is, yeah, so the productivity of the system. And yeah, it's a bit complex to know exactly what does it mean, but I want to give some intuition of what is happening there. Yes, basically, as I told you, for diversification to occur, C should be larger than all this, than the mortality of predation by ecomorphs, which means that once the predator evolves, it can halt diversification if this gamma is larger than this constant. So what happens, I will go try to get an intuition of it, is that, so we start with one population, right? It has not that much abundance because, well, it is in its ecological, it is starting its ecological equilibrium somewhere here. But this population diversifies, and every time it diversifies, it occupies more niches or uses more resources. And this increasing use of resources allows an increase in the abundance of individuals. So at some point, when the biomass has passed a critical threshold, a predator can evolve. And once this predator evolves, it depletes the abundance of its prey. So now there are the abundance and then biomass of the lineage decreases. And in our system, competition is, this is an emergent property of the system. It's not that we put it there, but it has been already described before this, this study, that competition for resources, how we put it in the model, can lead to split of these populations when competition is very strong. So when you put a predator, basically what you do is to decrease the density of the prey. And then when the density of the prey decreases, then competition for resources is not strong anymore. So the force that is behind diversification, which is competition for resources, is weakened when the predator is added. And then because when productivity is low, it will take the system the system will need to speciate into many more niches, to occupy many more, to use many more resources before it reaches that threshold at which the predator evolves. So as a result, in a highly productive environment, the predator evolves earlier, but because it halts the diversification process, then the system ends up, for example, here having only 8 species, while if productivity is lower, the predator will evolve once the system had diversified into 10 species, and then diversity will be lower in an environment with lower productivity. So I want to wrap up saying that eco-evolutionary feedbacks are central to understanding ecosystems, and that I hope I had show you that they can alter the behavior of bistable ecosystems, introducing rate tipping, for example, and producing a evolutionary induced regime shifts in these ecosystems. And also that they can influence the emergence of novel species and then novel trophic interactions, for example, in adaptive relations. I finally want to thank all my collaborators, and these 3 people here with the pictures are my co-authors in the studies I presented during this talk. Also, I want to thank my funding bodies, have been money directly from EMAC, SNF, and the Mercury Actions.
Thank you. Thank you, Catalina.
I'll be happy to hear if you have questions, comments.
Yes, I mean, now that we had the question sessions, just improvise and ask a question, right? We don't need to make a queue or something like that. Yeah. Erika or Emilio, sorry, Emilio.
Hi, nice talk. I am a little confused on if there is any rule or any theory guiding to the determination of the traits, which ones are important. For example, in the case of the macrophytes algae competition, I would say that the algae evolve faster. So I would put a trait on the algae and perhaps a trait about the algae and the macrophytes, and that will let them to evolve the two together. I guess that the outcome may be different. So is there any rule, any theory or anything to guide the modeler to say what are the traits that should be taken into account to model some process?
So let's say part of your questions, I can answer it saying, why did I choose that? Okay, so my choice was first, there was nothing on trade dynamics and in bistable ecosystems, right? So anything you would have done here at the point when I started to address here would have been novel. But I agree that maybe, so we have to think how exactly carefully we connect the threats to these ecological systems. So yes, I agree that algae probably have a faster evolution, but at the time I started to work on this, as I told you, there was nothing, and some people had already kind of some of my collaborators have already like do a perspective paper, and so without results or anything, proposing to model evolution in macrophytes. So I think this already shaped just my way to go there without but I agree that the algae is also super important, and then that I think is an incomplete understanding yet. First, is very theoretical. Second, so we need experiments and all that, but also because we are not looking yet at the coevolution. So this is still a lot to. There is still a lot to do in these systems. One of the things is coevolution, but there are many more things. I mean, all this is still unexplored in like in general trade dynamics in bistable ecosystems.
Yeah, more questions? Maybe I can kind of try to ask you a question, Catalina. This ratio, environmental rate versus evolutionary rate. So you have explored both using a single, right, a single environmental rate and a single trade. Have you been kind of thinking ways to expand these to two, let's say, two independent environmental, right, rates and two independent trades, or two rates that co-vary somehow? Have you been thinking around this? Because, right, maybe the ecosystems contain different environmental rates, right, independent forces driving these perturbations, or somehow do you have something in mind around these topics?
I have no answers in mind, but I have exactly the same questions. Yes, I mean this. So I started by the simple, but this is just the first step. I mean, this is a completely the eco-evolutionary dynamics in bistable ecosystems is new. This is also nice because I'm starting a new research line in ecology. So it's super exciting because there is a lot of things to do. Like what Emilio before asked and what you are now asking, which is what happening in a multidimensional space of environmental stress, with multidimensional traits responding differently to tolerance in these different environmental stress axes, right? Yeah, it's the things I plan to do in the future. So I'm hoping for funding for it.
Yeah, more questions?
I do have a question if there are no more deep questions. The way I understood your first part of the talk is that what was a minimum or what was a maximum in a potential became a saddle point by the introduction of a second variable. And that's a mathematical description, naively. In this type of processes, fluctuations or noise are very important in general in dynamical systems. Is that something that you consider, or can you think about any role of important environmental fluctuations?
Yes, so I did not talk about the other. I mean, there is, let's say, two more mechanisms of tipping. But yeah, like the other well-known is noise tipping, right? Which is exactly what you are saying. When we are in one of these two stable states, if the shape of the cup is not deep enough, then the system can, once it's perturbed, can easily pass to the other alternative stable state without crossing a bifurcation, just by crossing the unstable state, right? That's where these fluctuations of the environment are super important is through this mechanism called noise tipping. That I have not explored, and that can happen when you have rate tipping and also bifurcation tipping. I mean, if you have a system that is sensitive to rate tipping, it can also have, you can also pass through noise tipping to the other stable state. So I have not investigated that yet, but I'm really, yeah. So all what
I mentioned that because in statistical physics, there are well-established theories, what you call noise tipping, I would call it nucleation, but then nucleation theory in one variable or in many variables is very different. What you are doing is introducing an extra variable so that you have a saddle point where to escape.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I have not investigated yet like the effects of a fluctuating environment or stochastic environment in this, but all the three questions that you asked me are exactly what some points I have in a proposal I have submitted is exactly all those things that I want to go for in the future.
Very good, thank you.
I agree fully, it's super, all these things are crucial, that's why they are in my proposal.
More questions?
And maybe I can say also, so regarding also, so these fluctuations, the other thing that is important, the way I think it will be also important to investigate it is because alternative stable states in ecosystems usually involve the fact that in one of the states, it usually involves a change or a shift in dominance in species, or that one or more than one species is very abundant in one state and in the other very low abundant. So if you have these changes that are like fluctuating in the environment or stochasticity in the environment, this can be super important also in the state where one of the species is in low abundance, because then they will be very subtle to any fluctuation of the environment to have like enormous changes in their dynamics. Oh yeah, that's another reason why it's important. But again, I'm hoping to be able to respond those questions in the future.
Yeah, great. Anybody, last burning question? Yeah, I think then we are closing here. Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you, Catalina. Feel free to contact Catalina, like myself, for discussions about these topics. We really would be happy. So thank you everyone. Have a good afternoon. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.